Welcome to the What's Up Doc podcast. I'm Jeff Booth with your co-host Calissa Pollard. Calissa,
Hello, how's it going?
doing great, and we're excited to have our guest Irina Roska here, who's got an amazing background in supply chain and logistics with everything from sporting goods and equipment to food and beverage, and now in the healthcare world. And so we're really excited to have you. And Irina, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, first of all, both so much for reaching out and for the invitation. I am super happy to be able to share some of my experience with your listeners. So again, my name is Irina Roska. I have been working in supply chain for well over 15 years now, and I've actually worked across multiple industries, which I know we'll probably touch on later in this episode. Currently working in healthcare, and for the past couple of years, things have been fairly interesting in my world. And yeah, maybe we can share a little bit about that later on. But really excited to be here and just kind of talk about supply chain at large, as I know it's been a topic of conversation alive and well. And so hopefully we can offer a different perspective.
That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have tons of questions about the healthcare world, but I was curious, what was your first supply chain job? What was your first industry and what was your first role in supply chain?
That's a really good question. So my first role in supply chain was actually working for a five-star restaurant group while I was in my undergrad program, and I was responsible for all of their wine imports. So it was a lot of coordination with different organizations who work globally to import spirits and specific, wines of a, of different varieties within the United States. We were much more focused on the European market, but it really had a lot to do with planning the purchasing, forecasting everything, making sure that we negotiated the right pricing, and honestly, just making sure that there wasn't a lot of risk to different crops or anything that would potentially change the price of the wine 6, 12 months from now after we negotiated a specific contract
I
to
lost
then
Irina.
make
Did you
it
lose Irina, Calissa?
impossible for us to actually offer it um, to our customers at the price that we had kind of planned on. So that's really where it all got started. There was a lot of learning coming from that because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of rules and regulations, and specifically when things do go wrong, environmentally speaking, the price of wine, as well as the price of most foods, are the first to feel that change.
That's pretty wild. I think we think a lot about drinking wine, not a lot about how it gets here. So yeah,
Guilty.
that's definitely some additional challenges that I don't think we would have thought of. So uh did you go to school for that, and what made you get into, like, or did you just find yourself? We talked to a few people. The last person we talked to was like, I was in the military and they just had an open job, so I jumped to it. Were you going to school for a supply chain undergrad?
No, I actually I was a psychology major that quickly changed to
Me
political
too.
science. So I never unfortunately finished the psychology portion. But I've always been I'm a planner. And so I think that that's really, the team that I was working with at the time really, had a gap in the ability to plan. And sometimes, when you look at wine specifically, and I think that that maybe is the same for some spirits that need to be aged as well. But when you look at wine and how long it has to sit and the many different processes that it has to go through, and the fact that most higher level restaurants do plan their wine lists, well ahead of time. They make those commitments, and sometimes it spans over multiple years. And there's a level of expected quality, expected to on-time delivery, et cetera, for all of that. I think that that planning capacity and that visibility into the future, and why we made these decisions and the commitment from our vendors becomes even more important. I think that if you're thinking about a smaller kind of restaurant, that's probably not the case because most of their purchases are probably a little bit more at once. But if you're planning out your wine list, 1, 2, 5 years in ahead of time, then you're really, really needing to plan, specifically, the vintage, the costs, the timeline for delivery, and really get those contracts dialed in so that, again, if, for example, this year, I think well, not I think, the weather in France was pretty bad, and so I think that they have a really big issue with the delivery of champagne, where they actually think that they're not going to be able to, or the production of champagne for the year of 2022 is going to be almost non-existent by comparison to what they generally would output. And so if in the case that I'm presenting right now, if we were planning 5 years ago, we probably planned for a bottle of champagne produced in 2022 at a specific price. There is no way that price is going to hold, because now you're going to take, let's just, say 100,000 units of champagne bottles from one winemaker, and they'll probably put forth maybe 1,000 bottles. Well, imagine the price difference there, right? And so those are the types of kind of like planning horizons and questions that we asked ourselves. What could go wrong? And depending on how much wine you drink, there's a lot of these nuances that happen in different areas of the world. Sometimes that really do create a huge impact to supply and cost, and um, you know just the ability to kind of plan that out.
That's crazy. Yeah, we kind of see that in our truckload market, the real supply demand effect
Oh yeah.
really impacting pricing. But I thought that was a cool connection. So you go to school for undergrad psychology, and then you find your way into this, and now you're 15 plus years into the supply chain. And Calissa, what was your undergrad?
So yeah, psychology and sociology. Yeah.
And then from there, you got into, what was your first jump from there? Did you go into sales right away? What was your
Yeah.
first role after that?
Yeah. It was sales.
That's a
Hmm.
And
good
then
one.
Advertising.
sales and advertising. And then from there, you
Hmm.
went back to school.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
got a
then
master's in management information systems and completed that in 2019. So fairly recently. Yeah. And that's when I took the jump into logistics as
And
a
this is your
product
first
manager.
logistics job.
Yeah.
So I love hearing like all the different paths, right? Calissa, so you go to psychology, sales, marketing, and then you're like, oh, I want to get into the product side of it. And then you find yourself in logistics. Irina goes from psychology to working at this restaurant group, and she's like, wine's interesting. What about the supply chain side of wine?
Yep.
That's
It's
awesome.
fascinating. Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh, and then from there, I know you go to like some textiles and some things in between, but I was really curious about, is it skills? I don't know, SKLZ. Do you guys pronounce it as skills?
Skills. Yeah.
Okay. So you're in the supply chain for just sporting goods, I'd call it, general sporting thing. Like that seems one of the hardest ones because you're shipping basketball hoops, barbells, weights. Like I think of all these crazy things. A lot of the stuff probably coming from overseas and many different vendors. Can you give us a little bit of a feel of what that was like for those of us who have never been involved in the sporting goods supply chain or even like large furniture?
Yeah. So I think my first feedback is it was so much fun. And so I would encourage it. The culture is so fun. The people who you're working with, even overseas, there's the suppliers that would be involved in that type of like unit manufacturing. So fun, because everybody is still a kid at heart. Really, that's what sporting goods are, right? They're adult toys to still be able to play like you did when you were a kid. And specifically for skills, what we did is we had some amazing engineers who worked very closely with pro athletes. And so what they developed were solutions for pro athletes and individual students who wanted to work their way into a pro career for different sports. They essentially created these tools to really help athletes hone a specific skill. So if you're thinking about soccer, for example, we had this cover that would go over the soccer goal that would have openings only in the corners, which are the lowest probability places where a goalie can stop the shot, but also the lowest place where or like the lowest probability where a shot would go through. And so the idea is that the athlete, as they're using that in their training, that's where they shoot for, and so they learn how to get them in those tiny little holes, right? We had so many like that across literally almost every sport, including performance training. And to your point earlier about the kettlebells or the barbells, yeah, those are really kind of tiny, but they're super heavy. And the way that they have to ship, and that's like you reach your container load very quickly because you're maximized, like you're utilizing a quarter of your container, but you've maxed out your weight. So you have to consider a lot of that in terms of like how do you efficiently get that from overseas into the United States. But then we also had global distribution, and so it was an understanding of how do we get it to New Zealand, how do we get it to Australia, how do we get it to the Middle East, right? At a low enough cost to where it makes sense for our distributors globally to then turn around, sell that to the market, and it make financial sense. So that is one challenge. And then if you're thinking about to your point, basketball hoops or even soccer goals, right? Soccer goals are so long and they're like awkwardly formed, right? And they're heavy. And so similar thing where it's like you're maximizing a portion of your utilization, but you're not maximizing the amount of like all of what you would need to really get the lowest cost per unit. Um, so we had some really interesting challenges, and specifically as we grew, when I joined Skills, we were mostly working on a distributorship approach. So we had large distribution partners across the world. Specifically in the United States, we worked with Target, Dick's Sporting Goods, Big Five, Walmart, Amazon. Um, However, when I came on board, we really had a big push to continue to work with those partnerships, but really take our product to the market directly to the consumer. So we had a really big expansion of our e-commerce and our dropship capabilities during my tenure, and that was one of the most interesting things because when you're putting things on a container and then on a truck, you can kind of play a little bit of Tetris with it, do some consolidation overseas, and then see how you can maybe utilize the most space on your container or on your truck. But then if you're really having to ship a 12-foot goal from Carlsbad, California, which is where our warehouse was, to where more than 40% of the population lives on the East Coast, and there is that expectation that things that the order ship almost next day, that it arrived there pretty quickly. That's really where the challenges came in because we had to really understand what does it mean to us to service our customers, to enter this market of fast commerce and to really service our customers the way that they were, used to or that they are used to by other retailers in that market, right? So we worked very closely with a lot of our logistics partners. We did, some gravity analysis to really understand what does it mean, what makes most sense for us to like what does the product portfolio look like? What moves faster at different seasons? And there's sporting goods has a lot of seasonality because not everybody's playing the same sport at the same time. If you're thinking hemisphere to hemisphere, but even on the West Coast versus the East Coast, where the weather might be different at different times. So those are some of the main challenges that we had with sporting goods. It's also a scary place to be because people can get really hurt with these products. So it is a marketplace that's pretty tightly controlled by just consumer agencies at large. And so there's a lot of, just ensuring that the proper testing is done and just a lot of communication with overseas partners to make sure that the quality expectations and the testing and the rigor for all of that is properly flowing down the supply chain to then deliver that product to the end consumer in the fastest and best way possible, but also with a good shelf life for use.
Yeah, the safety and regulation stuff is, I think, something we don't think about. But man, customer expectations, right? It's crazy. What Amazon and a few others have really pushed us to just expect everything like same day, next day. I remember ordering something off the internet for the first time in like 2000. And I was just excited that it got here. Like it wasn't about time. It
True.
was like, I'm sending this out into the ether to whatever.com. I don't even know like if I'm going to get whatever I just bought. And now our expectations are just so much higher. But Calissa, do you have workout equipment in your home?
Oh yeah. I have a full gym. I have a
Okay.
full squat rack and yeah, like
Which is
free
pretty
weights and
crazy.
everything.
Where did you
Yeah.
buy it from?
I don't remember. My husband bought it, but I do remember the packages coming, and we were just kind of shocked. And during COVID, we decided to buy a treadmill and Nordic Track, I think it was, and it showed up in our front yard, and it was this massive thing, and we had to pack it and everything. It was sitting on a pallet, and we had to take it into our house ourselves because we didn't pay for any additional help, and we're fairly strong people, so we could do it. But I remember being like, we're gonna throw out our back. Like, it was almost fully pre-assembled, right? You just had to kind of put some pieces together, so it wasn't the worst thing. But yeah, and then we didn't know what to do with the pallet afterwards. We were like, just kind of sat in our backyard forever. And so I was pretty blown away with, yeah, being able to, because our expectation was very similar to Amazon, right? We just buy it off the internet. It gets here quickly, small enough to fit through our door. So, nope, none of that was, part of my
Yeah,
expectations.
you
Were just
start
blown
getting
away.
into like that industrial grade. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because what do regular people do when you're at a warehouse? The pallet goes in the pallet corner where you stack them up, and then you have a return vendor. But when you're regular people, are like, what do we do with a pallet? Do we go drop it off behind like the Walmart? Because I know they have a bunch of pallet. Like, what do I do with this thing? I don't have a dock. I don't know what to do with this. And
And I
so,
guess they're pretty valuable too. So like you don't want to
Yeah.
just trash it, even though it's kind of falling apart a little bit and it's splintering and stuff. Like I guess they're really valuable, and sometimes there's a shortage. And yeah, I forget what we did with ours, but probably could sell it.
You can't burn it. That is one thing you can't do,
Right.
because they're treated, and
the
so
chemicals.
we shouldn't do that for our own safety. No, but I think that that's actually a really good point, because it's we don't yet, and this is something that I would love to be a part of the solution for. We don't yet have a good reverse logistics market for the packaging that we put out. And if you think, there's that one company that does at home meal delivery, I think it's called Thrive, and they actually will send the driver back to pick up the cooler that they delivered it to you beforehand.
And
But
the dry
that's
ice packs, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but there's very few and far between. Like in the example that Calissa just gave, like it would have been great if they came back to pick up that pallet, but the cost to do that is so prohibitive because they didn't have another delivery to your house. And so that's literally just like an outbound cost that you really can't tie to anything else because it's not really a cost of sale, right? It's more like a cost of goodwill.
Right. Yeah. It's you want to do the right thing for the world, but it's not worth it to go back. And so, how do you justify that? And then do you create some relationship with the customer of, can you just hold it for a few weeks? Because we usually get one order every week in your general vicinity, and we'll swing back and we'll have room on the truck. But yeah, that's a weird dynamic. And I think that probably translates pretty well into where you are at currently, which is Helix, and you are focused on, the medical industry, whether that's genomics or viral surveillance, I think is what you said. But really, when I
Yeah.
think about it, it's like blood samples, tissue samples, and testing. But they're coming from our consumer homes, and we need to send them to a lab, or they're coming from small labs to a bigger lab. So, I think so often in logistics, we really think in reverse. We really only think of one way. We think of it comes from this manufacturer, a bunch of them go to one big facility, and then that big facility doles it all out to individual locations or smaller stores. But we don't really think about it the other way of, what if all thousand of us need to send something into one place? We don't really seem to have great systems for that. And you had kind of talked about that in the healthcare world in the future with telehealth. So tell us a little bit about some of the things going on in that world.
Yeah, no, I think I'm so happy that you brought that up because that's honestly been, just a little bit of background for the past almost 3 years now. Helix has been operating. So we are a genomics company, but and a genomics and a viral surveillance company. But we've really offered our capacity and our workforce to support with the efforts for COVID testing at large. Specifically at the time where that volume was very much needed, turnaround times for testing results were very slow. And so having a very high throughput laboratory here in San Diego, we kind of stepped up to support with those efforts. And so, very quickly we had to figure out, there's thousands of testing locations across the country. To your point, people can do, things from home. How do we, how do we make this happen at the lowest cost possible, but also in the fastest manner possible, right? So how do you really take something at the end of a business day, whether that be a blood sample or a viral, sample or a COVID-19 sample, at the end of the business day on the East Coast and get it to the West Coast no later than 7 a.m. the next morning. utilizing current services on the market so that we're not, having to create a new solution that then becomes cost prohibitive, right? So we always had to balance this idea of like, what does it cost? And what is the service that we're trying to offer? Because the ultimate goal is to make sure that that patient who came and tested and trusted you with that information and their sample, we want to make sure that they have that data, that piece of information as soon as possible, right? So our commitment was 24 hours from the time that you get tested, you will know so that you can make the best decision for you, your family, and everybody else. Um, and it was interesting because there wasn't a solution on the market. As you can imagine, on the East Coast, at the end of the business day, it's 5 or 6 p.m. on the East Coast. UPS has already done most of their pickups because and FedEx as well, right? Like they have to make sure that they put, those packages on their planes. Those planes are heading to Louisville or to Nashville, and they're sorting, they're moving, right? And so we really had to work with our service providers to create new solutions for how do we inject these packages directly into their supply chain. So literally bypassing anything else that they have as a structure in a city. So instead of going to a UPS drop box or going to a UPS store or meeting up with, having the driver pick these up or anything else, we actually had our packages with samples injected directly at the gateway at the UPS plane across 21 different states that we operated in. And that allowed us to literally claw out hours out of that supply chain to make sure that all of our packages made it on the plane right then and then got sorted and delivered. And we have been successful more than 96% for the past 3 years. Granted, there's some mishaps, and that happens specifically because of weather. But that really was the only way because there just isn't another solution. The way that these networks are structured and the barriers that we have to make sure that we're not slowing down everybody's supply chain, waiting for us. We really just had to just develop a whole new solution of taking it directly to that gateway.
So that's a really cool plan if I'm understanding then, right? We know our UPS driver picks some stuff up. We know we can go to the store, and you kind of came up with a solution where, hey, if you tell us where these gates are and we can deliver them with all the requirements you need, it'll save you money because you're not doing that on your side. It doesn't have to run through your normal supply chain, and we'll get the advantage of speed. You don't have to have the operational cost, and then we'll get the advantage of cutting out the time. And can we come to an agreement where we take ownership of this part of it, and then you take the air travel or whatever that next leg is? And you were able to build that with your partners?
Yes, we were able to build that, and we essentially, so it is a little bit of work on our partners' end because while they don't generally staff somebody at the gateway, they did at all gateways across the United States where we were operating. I think it ended up being somewhere around like 60 different gateways across all the 21 states we were in. They don't generally staff somebody at the gateway for package receipt. So they did have to do that where a driver was waiting for our drivers at the gateway. There was a handoff and a scan for complete chain of custody on everything. And then but we were literally the last delivery in. The plane was waiting for us and then taking off because sometimes in any given market, we could have been, consolidating 300 different collection locations, right? Where our drivers went to every single collection location, and then there was a point of aggregation, and then another one, and another one, and then the final handoff. So it's pretty fascinating the way it works because, to your point, it's not the way that we plan logistics generally. It's a complete diversion from what we generally plan, and we're essentially breaking that up and building it back in a different manner.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
instead of going from a distribution center into everyone's homes, now you're having to take these samples from everyone's homes and somehow getting it to the distribution center. And some companies like Amazon kind of do that when you try to return something, but for the most part, they're like, just keep it. It's too much hassle for us to figure out how to get it back to that distribution center. So just, keep the item. Don't worry about it.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, and that's right. Amazon, I have noticed that Amazon is doing it a lot more now that they have their own drivers out. And then Amazon is also able to do a pretty good analysis on, do we have any other planned deliveries in that area? Then it makes sense for me to go pick it up. Otherwise, so it's a very quick cost analysis for them. Like, what is the actual cost of going out of our way to pick these up? I think that if we lived in more rural areas, we'd probably get to keep more things. But no,
Well,
I mean, it's an absolute challenge.
and they benefit from density, right? Like that's part of it. If
Absolutely.
you constantly have trucks going to a neighborhood, it's just a lot easier to do that. I imagine in the healthcare field, it's much different, right? The priority levels are higher, and there's more compliance. You mentioned chain of custody things. There's obviously things like temperature control. I mean, there's a lot that goes into making sure a sample stays live, but we don't all have medical issues at the same time, right? And
Right.
maybe there's some seasonality to that to some extent, and maybe with COVID and flu, but for the most part, general telehealth, where Amazon knows that Black Friday and Christmas, there's some density. With us, I think it's probably harder to predict that, and so you have these people that want to send things in. You're like, I don't know when the next time someone else is going to need a telehealth procedure, but to the point of we're so spoiled from a cost perspective, you're like, oh yeah, we can do that. It'll be $150 extra. And you're like, that's crazy. Why would I pay that? But it's like, because there is no infrastructure for this. We're literally currying just for you, and you're not spreading that or subsidizing it across your whole neighborhood or hundreds of people. Like, it's this one person coming to get your one shipment, which is the least efficient way to do it. So I think I feel your pain a little bit, and what that would be like. But where do you kind of see the future of telehealth? I know me and Calissa kind of chatted a little bit about this, but a world where we don't go into doctor's office for checkups, but like I get a home kit that lets me draw my own blood or saliva sample or things like that at home, much like 23andMe is kind of really made as like a mass example. Do you see that as a future, and if so, like how do you think the logistics of that start to look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if we look at one of the challenges right now is that most of the at-home healthcare solutions are very specific, targeted, and expensive. And what I mean by that is there isn't I mean, now there is, a COVID-19 or like a flu test that you can do at home. But prior to the pandemic, there certainly wasn't. And if you're thinking really outside of that realm, there really isn't anything. Like, we offer genetic testing at home. There are some organizations who will offer fertility testing at home. And all of these are very sensitive shipments from the perspective of the sample itself, the integrity of the sample, the PHI that is, integrated within the shipment, etc. But very specific, right? Like, it's unlikely that an entire neighborhood is going to do genetic testing all at once or fertility testing or whatever else. There's very, 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 very specific solutions, right? And so Uber has created Uber Health, has created Lyft, like a solution for health care. And basically, what they are doing is they are offering their services to go to the patient's home and pick up their sample and then potentially meet up with the FedEx and UPS, hand off that sample to ensure the fastest delivery back to that lab. The challenge is, whenever we think about, we know that one of the biggest challenges in completing the service to the patient is actually getting the patient to return their sample in a timely manner, because all of the reagents that ship out with the collection material for the sample that are meant to hold the integrity of the sample, they have an expiration date, they have a shelf life, right? And so what we want is to ensure that that patient utilizes the unit that we've shipped out and returns it back to us as soon as possible with the lowest impact to them and the highest, on-time delivery possible. To do that with the lowest impact to the patient, the United States Postal Service is really the only option, because what does it mean to have the lowest impact to the patient? You're not asking them to pick up the phone and schedule a delivery. You're not asking them to leave their house and do a drop off at UPS or FedEx. You're not asking them to do anything else but potentially walk that box to their mailbox. and then have somebody come through and sweep it. To do that, you don't really have the benefit of that very fast, quick delivery. Most things within the USPS network take a little bit longer than they would with an early AM next day, Saturday potential delivery, or Sunday, depending on if FedEx brings that back. But right, like the idea is you're kind of stuck with specific partners depending on what it is that you want to achieve. And I would say that when we look at those solutions, it's so much more about how inviting is this to the patient? How much are we curtailing their ability to actually return this if we ask them to take another step? There's elderly patients who may not be able to take that step, right? So it's the idea of how much do you facilitate the ease of return with ensuring that the integrity of the material returned is intact, with ensuring the privacy and the security of the patient information, and also ensuring that the thing actually gets returned on time. And so while there, like I said, there are some solutions, even the Uber and Lyft healthcare solution, it does actually still require the patient to make a phone call and let them know that they're ready, right? So what I'd say is that I'm noticing changes in the market. I wouldn't say that we have a solution. And part of that is because also it's very hard to understand what the patient is doing. So, for example, if we were to say we can gauge the time that a return might be ready by the time that the patient has registered their sample, right? It's not really true, because then you can send the driver there the next day and the next day, and the patient might not be ready. We can't just very well knock on the door and be like, hey, is your sample ready? So there's a lot of, and this is what I mean, where we have done so much work in understanding consumer behavior in consumer marketplaces. I mean, we can cut it however way we want it, right? Know exactly how many t-shirts of a specific kind we might be able to sell. But we haven't taken that same approach in understanding trends in healthcare. And as we look to maybe not going into the doctor's office for simple testing and taking that and bringing it to the patient's home in a broader scale, I think that that's the question that we have to really understand and dig into. How do we understand at-home patient behavior as well as we understand consumer behavior for at-home services?
That's an awesome point, and I certainly feel it's just in anything in the healthcare industry. I feel like it's a black box, right? I'm not considered a consumer. I'm a patient, which then somehow we don't. Well, yeah. Why do I know so much more about my willingness to buy a T-shirt than my health behaviors? Because we've never. I don't think in healthcare do we think about the consumer enough, right? I know most of my healthcare experiences. I'm never really rating 10 out of 10. Like, wow, that was great. Like I was treated like a customer because I didn't have a lot of options, right? It was kind of limited, a little bit of a monopoly there, but I think that's really interesting. And then you talked about some of the things that U.S. Postal Service. So this is kind of near and dear to my heart. My whole family's like postal workers, like my mom, my dad. My dad remarried my stepmom. Like my whole family, I'm like the only person not in the postal industry. But it's funny. I read, so many things we get pretty upset about how inefficient and how expensive the postal industry is. It's not a viable business. And it's like, well, no, it's not. It's a service. Like you talked about, who else is going and checking your mailbox every day to bring stuff back for you? Like that is something we subsidize. It is a government service. It's not meant to be a profitable business, because if it was, somebody would have privatized that in an effective way. But I think people struggle to see that balance. Like, I want the post office to run efficiently. They're like, but I also want a package to get picked up every single day without me asking anyone. It's like, well, there's a little bit of a give and take here, right? We
Right.
can't have both.
That is inherently inefficient, right? Like
Right.
we have to pay for that gas and for that time of somebody literally just randomly driving around and checking on you every single day.
Right. It's a government service. And so I think I always find that kind of humorous. And same thing, like I'll go out, we have a lake like 45 minutes from my house, and I'll go out there and I'll take like a back dirt road, and I go down at 20 minutes and there's 5 mailboxes because there's 5 people who live out there. And it's like, yeah, FedEx and UPS would trip charge you 50 times. They would never go
Oh
to
yeah.
it. But we do that without cost. Someone drives down the dirt road, loads in mail. And so I think that's interesting too, how you reference of like, hey, that is a backbone and infrastructure there that's available, but it's just not at the high speed we need. So how do we find that balance of using what's available or using the Uber and Lyfts? I think that's a really cool concept. And I'm curious, I haven't done any telehealth things, not even like a 23andMe. Calissa, have you ever done like a home sample or had to, or like
Oh yeah.
telehealth, or you
Oh
have?
yeah. Oh yeah.
What was the
Yeah.
experience like?
I mean, it's great if you have like a common cold or something. You just call your telehealth doctor, and they'll give you some medication sometimes, or they'll tell you what you need to do. If it worsens. And then yeah, anything that you can do from home. Yeah, we're big fans of all of that stuff. And I was kind of a big fan of Theranos, which that would be like the ultimate vision, right? Of
Yeah.
actually being able to, yeah, just prick a little bit of blood on your finger and put it into some magical machine that'll tell you everything that's wrong with you. Of course, that was all a lie completely, but yeah, it's really
Have you
fascinating to see
ever
it.
have you ever sent a sample in? Like, have you done 23andMe or anything, Calissa?
Yes, yeah. Hmm. Yep.
And
And we
same.
give it to our family all the time for like Christmas presents and everything. Like, who wants 23 Me? Let's do it.
So what was the 23andMe experience like for you? Like,
Yeah, it was great. And I think, back to Irina's point, it's like it because saliva is, not something that's going to get ruined over time. It's not like a rush. So you can just, spit into this little vial and then package it up and send it whenever you want to send it. It's not like you have to like worry about it expiring or anything. So I can see where all of the issues come in when you actually try to send in some sample that will expire.
gotcha. And then
Yeah.
Irene, you had kind of mentioned to us when we first chatted a little bit that you thought other industries, and you touched a little bit about it on consumer knowledge there and forecasting, but were there other things? I think you had kind of inferred that maybe you thought the healthcare supply chain didn't have enough tools built specifically for it. Like you'd seen other industries and you thought, wow, somebody really built you, whether it's a great TMS or order procurement. You said you saw those, but you haven't really seen them into healthcare. And you thought maybe there were some opportunities for people to maybe translate some of those tools, get some learnings from other industries, or even develop like healthcare specific logistics software. So, I know we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on that.
No, I think that it really kind of ties into this, right? Like we have just coming from a consumer marketplace. I have worked in textiles before, which is why I kind of even equated that t-shirt discussion because I know exactly how much data goes into making a decision to purchase a new set of, and I didn't work in t-shirts, but we worked in large textiles, so like blankets and throws and etc. But the amount of data that we gather from the market to place an order and to manufacture, produce, and distribute that is enormous, right? And we tie in different enterprise or our enterprise management system with our TMS, with our WMS, with like right, you have visibility across board of like your order to cash system. You have purchase order management systems that are tying in so that you can update your demand system so you can make the right commitments to your customers. And then same thing, you've got your demand system feeding your ERP system so that it raises different flags in terms of changing demand, everything else. That does not exist in healthcare. We are making all tons of siloed decisions because our laboratory management systems and enterprise resource management systems aren't really meant to work together. There's a lot of barriers to doing that where it's like, why, if you know you have to have a WMS tie into an ERP, why wouldn't you have a lab management system tie into an ERP? It's the same thing. They're both production systems. They're running a shop floor. It's just that the shop floor is now a sterilized laboratory versus a 200 square foot warehouse, but we're assembling the same thing. You're producing a good, you're taking things and producing something else. So that's one example. But just on the demand end, how do we know how to improve service if we're not understanding what the consumer wants? And I realize that the consumer is a patient, but the reason that we call them patients is because we're never negotiating directly with the consumer for the care that they need. We're negotiating with the payers who don't gather the information that the consumer or the patients are releasing to the market. So there's a gap that needs to be bridged to where we are bypassing the payers and what they want, and going to the market and understanding how do we improve our services, and how do we really find out what it is that is needed from the consumer slash patients who are going to be impacted by the services and the data that we release back. This is a little bit not pertaining to Helix so much, because being a genetics company, we're a little bit different. But I did notice that just in terms of the COVID testing market that we were part of, right? So like infectious diseases at large, there's a lot of data out there. You can kind of understand, even when looking at the information that we have and the different testing trends and stuff, it's there's a ton of data that we can get out of that. But I don't think that's what it is. I think that there's a lot of ad hoc decisions and processes that we make. And then the final thing that I'll say, and I don't know how much you know about this, but one of the worst industries for inventory management are hospitals. They have no idea what's in their inventory constantly. So if you're ever interested and bored, go read about inventory management and supply management in hospitals. It is a complete mess. And so again, if we have a really good way of managing inventory on the shelf of a Walmart, how are we not able to manage inventory in a hospital? Things expire all the time, they get put away all the time. There's like reorders and rush orders and all sorts of issues that should never happen. But the reason that's happening is because hospitals generally don't have a proper like overall inventory management system. Different departments manage their own inventories and their own orders. And so there's a lot of clashing and lack of communication. Imagine doing that in the retail space.
Right? You'd go
That
out of
would that would
business.
you would go out
It
of business
just
in a hot second.
it wouldn't work. And I guess for me, that's always the big question of why hasn't anyone gone and solved this? Is it because people don't see that there's enough money in the medical space? Is like any idea of why people haven't, why it hasn't got more investment, more attention, or they're just not innovators in that space, or is no one developing it in house? Like it feels like it's hard for, I know if I was an entrepreneur, which I just try to live vicariously through entrepreneurs, I'm not one myself, but I would struggle to do anything in the medical industry because of the regulatory hurdles, the challenges. I think it would immediately just, if I was laying out my landscape of opportunities, that would always kind of go to the back of the line because I would be fearful about how hard it is to launch a product there, even just in inventory management. But I'm curious, like, is that the right track, or why don't you feel like there's innovation in that space?
I think that there's lack of innovation in this space for multiple reasons. One of them being the fact that from a top to bottom approach, most CEOs of most hospitals come from the medical field. And so it's hard to look back and see opportunities, like financial opportunities for streamlining things. Then most hospitals are very much set up in different departments, and each department is set up to manage their own thing. It's rare that there's like an overall inventory management solution for the entire hospital systems. And even if you're thinking about, most hospitals will have different satellite locations, so it's a sweeping change. It's almost like changing our insurance market, right? Like that's how hard it could be because of how disconnected everything is, and it would have to be like a top down approach. But that's I think where things are maybe a little bit more complicated. And then to your point, 1,000%, the barriers to entry in this market for any type of solutions are very, very high. The acceptance for new solutions are very low because it's hard to make the case for making a change if you don't really understand the financial impact of not making that change. And it's hard to understand the financial impact of not making a change if you don't have a leader who understands every bit and cranny of where costs are, higher than they should be. So I think it's really an across board challenge for the industry to really hone in some opportunities. And at the end of the day, we're not paying for it. So
We just, yeah,
if
we just
the
pay for it indirectly, and
right,
that's, I think
that's
that's what's
why
hard.
When you're going to
Everyone
the
wants.
doctor and you're like, "Why is my bill $5,000 for a shot?" Well, that's probably why, because they lost the first dose, they lost the second dose. I'm just making this up, but
It's
there
part of the
would need to be a
cost.
market push. Same way that there was a market push for consumers aren't going to pay for overnight shipping anymore because Amazon stopped making them, so now nobody else can make them, right? It's the same thing, but it's not a consumer negotiation, so it's tough.
Yeah, no, I think that's so interesting to me because I think a lot about the medical industry as a business a lot. And it's weird. I don't ever want my hospital to run like a business because I want patient care to be top of it. Except when I want it to run right, I want it to run like a business. So it's like, I don't want the revenue generation mindset of a business because then it's hard to say our business grows best when everyone is sick. That is how we get the most customers. So that's a weird backwards incentive. But on the other side, I do want it to run with the efficiency of a business of, hey, if we don't run this profitably or effectively or very efficiently, we will not be in business. So I want to have that same kind of vigor and excitement around managing the P&L and L and running effectively just without the revenue generation side. And it's probably really hard to find an executive leader like that who's like, I need you to care about people so much and so empathetic, but be like really financially diligent and run this like a ruthless corporation from a cost perspective, but while loving and caring everyone. So you can, yeah, like that's a weird balance to
Yeah.
do. So that really makes a lot of sense. Calissa, I know I'm kind of geeked out on this topic right now. What I mean, do you have any thoughts or anything when you kind of hear all this?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely. I think, every time I've been to a hospital and you get the bill at the end of the day and you're just like, okay, they gave me Tylenol and it's like $30 when I can go buy like five, gallons of Tylenol for that same price. Like, what is going on here? But that really makes a lot more sense. I think I never really thought of it that way. So great
Yeah, it's a
insight.
great way to put it with the multiple shots, right? It's kind of like part of running a retail store. You have, 5 to 10% shrink, which is damages in sales. Well, that just gets built into the price because you need to offset those costs. So same thing to Irina's point.
Yep.
If you mismanage, inventory, things like that, it just gets rolled up into the total, which eventually makes its way back down to you, the payer, the consumer. So, um, I feel like we can talk a whole nother thing about just the medical industry and how supply chain could benefit it. But I know we're at about 50 minutes now. Thank you, Irina, for taking so much time with us and talking about your background, in particular the medical healthcare stuff and the sporting goods. I think are so interesting. Any last words you want to leave us with?
No, I mean, just supply chain is a fascinating, you know, place to be, not just because I'm actually in it, but just because I think that it helps us understand better kind of the world that we live in and why certain things happen the way they do. So I'm always happy to share any of my experiences and my time, and I am so happy to have spent the past hour with the both of you and your audience. And I'll look forward to hopefully doing this again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Calissa, anything from you
Definitely.
before we close out?
No, I just really appreciate Irina's time. Thank you so much. This is very insightful and I don't know, really fun to just chat with you. So it's great.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. We'll look forward to the next one. Bye, guys.